Hello, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Nabila Rahman hosting today's Light and Lens of United News of Bangladesh, UNB. Today we have a very special and distinguished guest, and it's our honor. He's originally a journalist at The Economist, Lord Mark Malloch Brown. He also served as United Nations Deputy Secretary General, Vice Chairman of the Soros Investment Funds, and the World Economic Forum. He was also the Prime Minister's envoy for the London G20 summit and Foreign Office Minister with responsibility for Africa and Asia with a seat in the cabinet. He has a remarkable breadth of leadership experience and insight across international politics, investment, and development. For several years, he ran the full gamut of UN activities around the world, from politics to peacekeeping and diplomacy. This made him the chief operating officer of several 100,000 person organization. So welcome aboard, welcome to UNB, and most importantly, welcome to Bangladesh.
Thank you.
In our brief chat, you were telling us that you've been to Bangladesh a few times.
Yeah, well, I used to be head of the UN Development Program, and remember the dramatic flooding and UNDP's annual support to try and help contain that, and coming here during one of the worst periods of flooding, and watching Bangladesh as a society getting to grips with flooding, learning how to mitigate its effects, how to improve housing, to prevent the worst damage, how to move people when necessary. So I saw a country which had learned how to mobilize itself to address the challenges and vulnerabilities it felt and it faced. And now I come back 10 years later. Last time I came here was as a British
That was
minister.
a long time, 10 years, yeah.
And obviously a lot has changed. A lot of economic growth, which is both good because it's created wealth and opportunity. There's also consequences, huge pressure on the urban infrastructure. The streets are busier than ever, more cars jamming them. And you can imagine that there's a big sort of lag between the wealth that's being created and the need to have infrastructure which keeps up with it, and which keeps up with some of the less happy sides of what's going on in the country, which is displacement of people from coastal areas because of rising sea levels and salination of their land, displacement into the slums of Dhaka and other cities. So, this is a country with a big social and development agenda still. The challenges of managing growth fairly and equitably, of managing and containing climate change, of dealing with, problems which Bangladesh has inherited because of its neighborhood of, refugee pressures, etc. So, an exciting place to be.
So it's interesting that you say that. Now that we are graduating from LDC to the next level, there's a lot of growth, yet you see still a lot of poverty. And with the whole challenge of the climate change, do you think that the United Nations and other international bodies are doing enough for the countries that are going to be impacted? And already you're saying we are already impacted with it.
Well, look, are they doing enough? No. Is the United Nations a critical part of the solution? Yes, because if you look at Bangladesh's climate-related crisis, it's got two roots to it. One is the flooding of the river basins, and where does that come from? Neighboring countries and their water management, deforestation, loss of topsoils, dams, you name it. Bangladesh is extremely dependent on how the upriver countries behave, and Bangladesh's case, those are some very big, powerful neighbours, and it needs the framework of the United Nations to address an equitable burden sharing of how you deal with an issue like that. The second dimension to Bangladesh's climate change are the coastal areas, where, in general, global warming, nothing to do with Bangladesh, is rising the sea levels in the way that is causing these effects to coastal communities in the country. Again, Bangladesh on its own would have no means of addressing those issues. It's got to be through global agreements and their enforcement. And the UN has done half of a good job on the global agreements. They're not yet ambitious enough, and a very weak job on enforcement because countries, governments, are so reluctant to sort of weigh in behind their rhetorical commitments and really change their economic and social behaviours in a ways which would impact and limit temperature increases in the world.
And I think we started a lot earlier. Like, for example, we don't have plastic bags.
Yeah.
You know, we've stopped that, I think, like maybe over 10 years ago, I would say. We don't have plastic bags even in shopping. So, I mean, we have started,
Yeah.
and I think countries like you see the Amazon that's happening, in the rainforest, the wildfire. I mean, these are all, creating global warming, climate change, which are going to affect, and I don't know if with our future generation, what's going to happen. Maybe we will see it in our lifetime.
Yeah.
And, and it's we collectively, not just Bangladesh, but global communities, including UN, who has such a strong veto power to actually make that first, change or, push the countries, give them taxes. I don't know the solution. I'm sure you don't know the solution also. It's like, it's much more complex, but we need to start talking about it, and we talk about it. And I think that's a great awareness on the first level, but there needs to be more policy changes on each country, like plastic bag, straws. Like, these are little things, but every country can start doing. Every little bit helps. Like a straw, I was reading, stays in the environment for like the plastic for like 70 or 80 years. One straw. Can you imagine how much we waste?
But the trouble is, it is a very, even this has now got politicized. So believe it or not, in America, one of the Trump campaign things that are being sold for the forthcoming presidential campaign are plastic straws, because Trump supporters hate being given paper straws that don't work. So you've got, and it's not limited just to the US, it's in Brazil, it's in many countries, you've got this sort of reaction to this environmental movement, which is highly polarizing. Some of the protests in France against President Macron by the people who are wearing yellow vests, the Gilets jaunes, were because he was trying to raise fuel prices, which would increase their rural commuting costs. And this was again, felt to be an elite Parisian thing that wasn't really, understanding their thing. So whether it's Trump supporters wanting the right to go on using plastic straws, or drivers of beat-up old Peugeots in France wanting to use gas-guzzling cars, there are a huge array of political problems everywhere that need to be tackled, and they won't get tackled unless there is a kind of global demand, an organized global demand for everybody in every country to change their behaviors and moderate their consumption.
Absolutely, because the waste in one country is just not impacting that country. It can happen to your neighboring countries or the ozone layer. Like, it's a global issue that needs to be addressed, and we're looking for. I know you are not in UN anymore, but it keeps coming because you had such a strong and powerful position. So you have all the connections, all the powerful people. So we all want to know the the whole UN ideology, philosophy, and where they're going with this whole climate change. So that's why. So to my next question, which is very close to Bangladesh's heart, is the Rohingya issue. And what, according to you, should be done to expedite the whole repatriation process?
Well, the real responsibility for successful repatriation lies at the other end, the Myanmar end. The Myanmar government has to be able to give plausible, credible, bankable commitments to the people, the Rohingyas, that if they go home, they are not going to be subject to violent attack. Their civil and legal rights are going to be properly protected, and they're going to have an opportunity to recover their economic livelihood. And I don't think there are any Rohingya who, out of choice are in the pretty desperate, crowded, unsanitary conditions of the camps in Cox's Bazar. They're there because they feel their lives are at risk if they go home. And so, and we have to crack that issue. We have to see a kind of welcome mat at the Myanmar end, which is plausible, credible, believable. And that is going to take both action within the Myanmar government for Aung San Suu Kyi to push back against the military elements who are such a dominant voice in security issues in Myanmar, and say this isn't a security issue, it's a human rights issue, it's a democratic issue, it's an inclusion issue. And that has not yet happened. And then secondly, international friends of Bangladesh and indeed of Myanmar have to be very, very vigorous in pushing for a solution. China, who's obviously already involved, but more broadly the UN community. And, to be honest, frankly, Myanmar, is an attractive, newly discovered country for many other countries. They've been excluded from engagement with Myanmar for a long time by sanctions. They're now in there, engaging in all sorts of investment activity. And they have to be told, whoa, hold on a moment. This issue has to be solved. Myanmar's economic advance cannot be based on, somehow overlooking or putting under the mat this terrible, terrible human rights refugee crisis, which was generated by the authorities of the country.
Yeah, and I think other countries are also learning from it. For example, what's happening in China with the Uyghur.
Yeah.
Like, how is the Chinese, they probably won't say anything because they're doing the same thing to their minority Muslims.
Yeah.
And similar things happening in Assam. That's, I think, going to be another kind of Rohingya situation if things are not contained.
Yeah.
With the 1.9 million people dubbed as illegal Bangladeshis, but they are actually Assamese people. I mean, they have nothing to do with Bangladesh, and they basically, again, kind of learning from the whole Myanmar thing of like ethnic cleansing, which is happening for whatever it's, the minority. And it's just sad that we live in a world where we are so globalized and we are all so forward thinking, and all the countries can push, but at the end of the day, the ruling country is denying it or, not doing anything about it. So what can United Nations do in this situation?
In a way it's going back to basic principles, because the United Nations, in a significant part of its original concept, was to give a forum to poorer, smaller countries to allow them to stand up to bigger neighborhood bullies.
Yeah.
And, in a sense that's got lost as the sort of P5 have dominated the decision-making of the UN, and, the smaller countries' voices have been confined to the sort of Tower of Babel of the General Assembly and not been heard sufficiently around these issues. And, I've argued since being in Bangladesh on this trip that, Bangladesh is a sort of modern Sweden or Norway. It's a very large country, but nevertheless small by the standards of its neighbours. It has a huge interest in, an open global economy which respects the rule of law, whether it's to advance its trade and investment interests, whether it's to handle climate change, whether it's to handle refugees. And so, it's the kind of country which should push itself into the front row of those determined to sort of relaunch the UN, strengthen it, and be powerful voices in its support, and to insist on it being deployed as the multilateral platform for resolving issues which, if they're left to bilateral resolution, leave a Bangladesh up against much bigger, more powerful neighbours like India or China.
And we need that kind of communication. India being our friends, China being our friends, but at the end of the day, everybody cares about their own country, and everybody has their own interests, with the political, the whole thing. So that given being said, we would need, like you said, big countries not to bully us, and that's why we look up to United Nations. And yes, they've done great things for peacekeeping. We are, I think, the number one peacekeeping troops, and our military makes money out of it. They get training, they get better, they create relationship with other countries. And I never knew this, but I'm sure obviously you know this, but Sierra Leone, I'm telling our viewers this, if those who don't know, in Sierra Leone, because of our peacekeeping troop, they were so impressed that they made Bangla their national language. And that makes me proud because, not that they speak Bangla, but it's the national language. And I think that's, very commendable what UN has been able to do for the Bangladesh Peace Corps. But that's like, after a conflict has happened. But pre-conflict, how do you prevent a conflict from happening? I mean, Rohingya has already happened. Now the Assamese, there's a chance to make amends. There are the Uyghurs happening. Before it escalates to another war, there is a chance for United Nations, and I say United Nations because it is the whole world, the whole, all the countries are there. So, pre-conflict or before a conflict even happens, how do you prevent it from happening?
Well,
when I say you, I'm talking about United Nations, of course.
I mean, look, you take the Assam problem or the Uyghur problem. These two particular countries, India and China, have always been very rigid about even UN interference, as they see it, in their national internal affairs. And the only way that the UN plays a stronger hand in those situations is when countries, other neighbours and the global community all sort of come in behind the UN and insist that these problems must be headed off, because the UN is the sum of its member states. There's not something, there's not an independent source of power or authority to the Secretary General other than the Charter and the international treaties that it is his job to enact, but to or to secure agreement to from countries. But if those countries willfully disobey and insist on national sovereignty beyond his or her moral voice, it's got to be other countries, smaller countries, medium-sized countries, coming in and joining the battalions of the UN and saying, we want a world run in another way, where there is, guarantees that minorities are not going to be persecuted and that they are not going to become exported to their neighbours. So there's a whole set of behaviours which the UN is a vehicle for most of the world to combine in to stop big powers behaving badly. Now, the other bit of conflict prevention is that sometimes it's not big powers. Lots of conflicts happen out of small powers, but it is always difficult to get in early enough, because the government of the day will say, no, it's
we've got it under control.
It's under control. None of your
it's business. Yeah, it's our thing.
And so for years at the UN we have pushed for a right of protection, the R2P doctrine, as it was called, the right to protect, that was intended to give rights to the UN to send in efforts to diffuse conflicts, whether it was mediation, whether it was development or humanitarian assistance, and only last, and if necessary, some kind of military deployment to prevent communities going into conflict with each other. But this has been a incredibly contested strategy or approach, and frankly has lost ground steadily over the last 10 years or so, with more and more countries saying, no, it's our business, not yours. So again, the UN has no independent means to overcome that opposition. It requires countries like Bangladesh to say, no, we're going to lead a movement of states which is going to demand that there is a right for the international community to not intrude but engage with a country when there is a problem such as Assam or the Uyghurs or many others we can think of bubbling up. And at the moment, everybody says, oh, the UN isn't doing enough. The honest truth is governments are not doing enough to give the UN the authority to do what it needs to do on these crises.
So what do you think with this Assamese thing? What should we do in Bangladesh? What should the government do?
Well, it is this is a group who've had their rights removed, basically. And so in that sense, appeals to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the High Human Rights Commission in Geneva seem critical. A raising of it at the UN General Assembly this year, pointing to the risk of a pattern developing. of these kinds of behaviours, the possible tabling of a General Assembly resolution, getting many of India's friends in the developing world to support that resolution so that India feels isolated around this. These are all the sort of tactics which I'm not necessarily recommending, but which Bangladeshi diplomats can look at, because the suggestion of India that it's just dealt with by the two countries one-on-one, is in a sense already tipping the card table, in India's favour. You need friends to help you handle this.
Yeah, and it's a long process. I mean, sooner we start the better, because otherwise it may escalate to the Rohingya issue, and then we have all these 1.9, maybe 2 million or 3 million by the time this is over, new migrants coming in,
and Bangladesh is a country with great population density already, and huge development issues, the flooding and everything else that we've talked about. So it's not fair that it becomes the location that collects the rejects of its neighbours. And if you go back to Bangladesh's original formation, one of the exciting moments of early UN. I mean, there is, for many UN officials, I was not working at the UN, it was before my time, but for many UN officials, they remember the operation to create, in which the UN worked to repatriate people to Bangladesh, to move populations around, to politically support the formation of the country. It's got a sort of it's a real sort of badge of honour for the UN, the role it played in Bangladesh's creation. And I think Bangladesh needs to do a more powerful job of reminding the UN that Bangladesh's formation as a member state, as a nation, is deeply entwined with the UN, and the two country and organization sink or swim together.
Yeah, and also I agree. I also think that UN should put force when when something is wrong to their country, because most of the countries are part of the UN board. Yeah. And it has to be in your vested interest also, UN's, how much pressure you can put, because it's many accuse the UN and as an observer, as a spectator, than actually doing anything bold recently we're talking about. So the role of UN is failing, as the world is seeing, but the world is getting more complex. Yeah. The needs and urgencies are getting, we can't be waiting for a decision for over a year or two. Things are moving fast.
Well, look, I was lucky enough to work for the UN and for a Secretary General, Kofi Annan, when the UN was at the height of its powers. It was after the end of the Cold War. There was a moment of optimism and an opportunity that the world could really, start rowing in the same direction, and that, we were entering a long era of peace and prosperity. And, you could choose your own date as to when that came to a crashing halt, whether it was 9/11 or whatever, but at some point, boom, a new wall dropped down. And, so the current leadership of the UN is dealing with a much more contentious, difficult, divided world. A Security Council which pretty much can't agree on anything.
That's very candid of you to say that.
Well,
not many people would say it. Thank you.
But also a world where there are these massive geopolitical shifts of power. The rise of China, the contest between
the BRIC,
China and the US in Asia, the rise relative to the BRICS, as you say. The difficulties, though, that the BRICS also face with a lot of internal challenge and difficulty as their economies favour some groups and not others internally. The relative weakness of Europe, which was always had a role as a kind of soft power, calmer of passions, a region which had its own terrible history of world wars in the first half of the 20th century, but had become, if you like, a champion of UN and UN values and peacemaking. And now a Europe which, has got a much uglier face itself, failing on refugees,
Brexit,
failing in terms of its own, unity and Brexit, governments elsewhere, Italy, other countries, really problematic. So, it's a very unstable world, and in a way it's not surprising that the UN in that way is falling short of people's hopes for it.
Yeah, of course. And so absolutely you're right. And I'm going to thank you for your time. Very valuable. We learned a lot. And we hope that in this complex world, with climate change, with economics, new superpowers coming, with challenges, we as a country, not just Bangladesh, but all countries of the world, need to fight for what's right. Yes, everybody will have their own agenda, but at the end of the day, we have to take care of minorities. We have to take care of our future generations, so we have to do a little bit something for the climate, even if it's something simple as not drinking from plastic straw. So the countries needs to start, but we as people can also make a difference. So we cannot just look at the UN and the country ourselves, but we can start ourselves. So thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, viewers, for your time. And I hope to see you in the next Light and Lens session. Signing off from UNB. Thank you.
Thank you, UNB.